All right, guys, welcome back to another video. Or actually, we're going to continue our conversation about slavery. Uh, this time, though, we're going to be looking at the anti-slavery movement, the abolitionist movement, and looking at how this kind of grassroots, really kind of radical movement is leading actually into mainstream politics and will more or less be part of the major political platforms as we get closer to the Civil War. Abolitionism, like I said, has its um, history all the way back into the Quakers in Pennsylvania, but doesn't really gain steam as a major political force until the 1830s. So the main question, though, we're looking at is right here: how did the abolitionist movement further divide the North from South? As you can imagine, abolitionism, especially as we get into the 19th century, is going to be much more radical. It's going to be much more divisive. They're going to be less likely to compromise, which is unfortunate. But at this point, many abolitionists are getting impatient. So it's going to divide the North from South. It's going to be purposely executed in that way. And many of the early abolitionists don't care. They're very comfortable with making the South seem backward and brutal and casting them as an enemy. And this will further divide tensions between the North and South and, kind of cast each side as, quote, the other, right? And when you do that, when you lose commonness between two groups, that's when you can actually have war. First, we're going to have a little quote here from William Lloyd Garrison. He's going to be one of our first abolitionists that's going to gain popularity. Love this quote: "Enslave the liberty of but one human being, and the liberties of the world are put in peril." Right? Pretty good stuff. Once again, these kind of notes are going to be available under our download section, and they mirror almost completely the textbook, the online textbook here on ushistory.org, chapter 28. So let's get into it. First and foremost, what are we going to do about slaves, right? As we start to figure out, should we, keep them? Should we get rid of them? One of the actual first kind of accepted solutions to slavery is to get rid of them, right? Colonization. And we don't mean colonization of the United States. We literally mean colonization of other areas of the world, sending slaves back to where they originally came from, right? And the mentality for that was, hey, they were brought here by force. Why not send them back to Africa? Of course, I'm not sure who would want to sign up for another Middle Passage going backwards. It's already bad enough coming here the first time. So it seems a little bit weird that this would be an actual viable solution to the problem of slavery, but it was put forward by many. And the area that they said that would be a great place to go was Liberia. Now, Liberia is in Africa, and here's a little map. It's actually in the southwest coast of Africa. And I've not done a lot of research on what Liberia was like before slaves were returned there. In fact, if one of you wants to do some research and send that to me, I'll give you a test point. But this was, this area was considered a viable settlement area for slaves to be shipped off to basically go back to Africa and have their own country, right? That they can dominate, and if they were to do so, then maybe some of these ills of slavery would be remedied. Once again, some do sign up to do that. It is a country founded for that to happen, but there are many, many blacks that actually in the South do not support this. Many slaves do not support this. There are several reasons for this. First, and the most obvious, is that the most had never been to Africa at all, right? So the idea of being sent back to Africa, at this point, they are Americans. They have been here for generations. Even if you had been alive and experienced the Middle Passage, you're probably not real keen to want to do it again. So once again, it was a foreign nation, right? They have no history in Africa. Second, many believe that they had helped build the country, right? And as a result, they believe that they would be able to live as free citizens in the United States and kind of enjoy their labors. They had, this is undoubtedly true, they had been part of the actual construction of the American economy, of American culture, and they wanted to kind of be part of this system again. So it makes sense, right? Why would I give this up? I've been working here for generations. My family is firmly seated here potentially for centuries. Why would I opt to go back? So there was actually a lot of opposition to that. Now, abolitionism in general had many differences from early abolitionists. This time it's going to be a lot more radical. Okay, they don't want a gradual end to slavery. They want slavery to be over immediately, and they don't care if the South, needs help with kind of figuring out this system. They want it to be done right now, and so they're going to push very, very hard and send pamphlets, petitions, the politicians, right, and they send basically propaganda, inflammatory literature to the South, including this publication, The Liberator, to try and drive this process of abolitionism as quickly as possible. And what happened as a result of this is that Andrew Jackson and other members of Congress basically force a gag rule. And Andrew Jackson actually makes sure that the post office does not deliver this mail, right? If they know that there's an abolitionist organization sending inflammatory literature down, they make sure it doesn't get delivered. They also have a gag rule in Congress making it impossible for anyone to talk about slavery at all, right? So, pretty brilliant strategy, I guess. I'm being sarcastic here, right? Oh, we got a problem with slavery? Well, let's just not talk about it. Let's not deliver the mail. Let's pretend that it doesn't happen, right? And that's one of those major lessons of history. Whenever you try and cover up an issue or pretend like it's not an issue, you probably make it way, way worse and create way more division doing it. It's better to probably tackle it head on. But that wasn't the response of the federal government. They decided that they were going to go ahead and just ignore it. Now, our first major abolitionist is William Lloyd Garrison. We're going to talk about him. He's this guy right here, a white man from the North. Okay, and he is going to, he probably is the most famous abolitionist that we're going to talk about. Okay, his background is that he's initially for colonization, but he's going to change his tune. He's going to publish this periodical, The Liberator. Right, he's morally outraged over the issue of slavery, and those who are reading it, which are actually mostly African Americans, are going to push forward quite forcefully this cause of abolitionism. They want to make sure that this cause becomes mainstream, and the rhetoric they use inside these publications is pretty harsh. Garrison uses language that shows how immoral slavery is. He actually runs presidential candidates on the Liberty Party. He burns a copy of the Constitution and even calls for the North to secede from the Union. Right? As a result, he's not really rewarded, as you can imagine. I'll pull up your textbook real quick. It says in their textbook that he's actually dragged through the states and almost killed as a result of this. I am in earnest. I will not equivocate. I will not excuse. I will not retreat a single inch, and I will be heard. So this is the kind of general sense that we get from abolitionists like Garrison, right? They take no quarter. They push people to the edge, and as a result, he's going to be kind of hailed as a global crusader, but he's going to have to wait quite a while. In fact, 34 years for any of this to be realized, from the first publication in 1831 to the 13th Amendment getting rid of slavery in 1865. Garrison kind of has to sit and wait and watch. It's a very slow process to try and get slavery gone. But he is alive to see it all happen. He does get to kind of enjoy the fruits of his labor, so to speak. Now, it's not just white people who are abolitionists. Like I said before, actually in the majority of readership for The Liberator was free African Americans. 75% of them 75% of the subscribers to that publication were African American. But there also were a number of other abolitionists that were free African Americans. And the three major ones that we talk about here are going to be David Walker, I'll highlight real quick, David Walker, Frederick Douglass, and Sojourner Truth. Those are going to be three major free black abolitionists. Probably you only heard of one. Probably Frederick Douglass is really the only one you've ever heard of. By the way, I probably spelled his name with just one S somewhere in a note or a quiz. I always forget it's got two S's, but it's Douglas. Very S-y last name. Anyway, he's probably the one you've heard of. There's two other ones. David Walker is pretty amazing. He's kind of one of those figures kind of shrouded in mystery. He publishes a pamphlet known as The Appeal, actually before The Liberator. Once again, it was very radical, right? And he actually highlights four major ills that plague African Americans. And listen to this list real quick. Some of them are obvious, and some of them are kind of shocking. The first, most obvious, slavery, right? Obviously, that's a great harm to African Americans. Ignorance, right? Ignorance is the second one. Ignorance about what they can do about it. Ignorance about whether anyone's fighting for their cause. Ignorance for how the system works. That's the second one. Third, and most shockingly, is Christianity, right? Many slaves are using Christianity at this point actually to fight slavery, right? Like they're using the Bible, using the stories of Moses and Exodus to fight kind of against the ills of slavery. But interestingly enough, David Walker is saying, no, Christianity, in and of itself is actually keeping you kind of subservient, right? You're not necessarily aware of the fact that you're subservient or inside of this white system. The white God, right? White missionaries have taught you this, and so he will kind of criticize Christianity as a cultural kind of trap for African Americans. This is actually going to be re-echoed about 100 years later, actually over 100 years later. Malcolm X is going to kind of pick up this banner as well. And part of his rejection of white culture will be a rejection of Christianity, which is why he, of course, is going to convert the Nation of Islam. Last, the fourth thing is colonization. He thinks that the opening of colonies and the spreading of the slave system is also going to be a very, very harmful thing to African Americans. So, his history, other abolitionists are actually kind of like incredulous over the rhetoric of his text. He dies mysteriously, right? So we don't really know what happened to this guy. He's certainly not going to be alive long enough to see his exploits or come to fruition. He's not going to see the slavery end. He's going to be dead and gone by then. Our next major abolitionist will be Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass, like I said, is probably the most popular one of these three. I'm almost certain you've heard of him. He is an ex-slave. He escapes from slavery when he's 21, moves to Massachusetts, and he's a house servant, actually. So he had access to the house, and as a result, probably access to more of the finer things in life, including the ability to read and write. He's a very talented public speaker. He's a very talented writer. And so when he escapes to the North, he immediately more or less finds a pocket of abolitionists to write from. And his works, especially his anti-slavery newspaper known as the North Star, right, will kind of be one of those major literary vehicles to increase the awareness of the slave system in the South. Douglass has to end up fleeing to England, though, because there is a fugitive slave law which requires Northerners to return their slaves. And as Douglass becomes more and more popular, it's not going to take that much for his former slave owner to figure out, oh, that's my former slave who escaped. But fortunately, other Massachusetts abolitionists got together and were able to buy his slavery. So anyway, we may read some of Frederick Douglass's stuff in class, but pretty influential figure, and also it just looks like a badass. Out of this picture in your guided notes, he just looks like one of those kind of seasoned old men that just has just fought the fight for decades. Very wise, and he was very wise, but a lot of times you'll see him kind of as a symbol, and an older symbol of abolitionism when slavery was still a legal entity in America. Last person we'll talk about is Sojourner Truth. Sojourner Truth was a woman. She was born in slavery in New York City, but was freed when the state outlawed the practice, right? So this is a northern slave, right? But she gets her freedom when the political climate of the North turns anti-slavery. And, she kind of changes her name, right? She kind of is a modern-day prophet, believes God wants her to travel up the country and spread the word, right? And she's also going to link her message of abolitionism to women's rights, okay? So she's a very, very active protester, not just for the slavery system, but also for women's rights and then anti-segregation after the Civil War. Next thing we'll talk about here is the Underground Railroad. This, of course, is led by Harriet Tubman, probably a name that you're very familiar with as well. Just to give you some sense of the operation, the Underground Railroad worked at night. It was operated by people known as conductors, right? Other train analogy. And they had different stations. These stations were homes and churches mostly of abolitionists throughout the South and the border states into the North. And about 3,200 conductors worked on the Underground Railroad. So this was I wouldn't say necessarily a huge movement, but definitely a lot of people were very active in the South moving slaves out. And I have a map on the guided notes. They're not just coming out of the eastern states and going to the Northeast. I think a lot of times we're kind of tempted to think that the Underground Railroad is kind of running through Washington, D.C., kind of this East Coast swing. But many are actually moving up the Mississippi River, right? Some of these larger veins of the Underground Railroad are actually going up the Mississippi and up the Ohio. And this would actually be the closest contact point to Canada, right? And once you're in Canada, then you're outside of the law, outside of the fugitive slave law. So many slaves are actually heading up there. Also, many slaves escaped south to Mexico, which I always think is interesting. I've never really considered what ex-slaves in Mexico were doing, or if there are still communities down there today. That would be something worth researching. Then, of course, through Florida, many even went out to the Indies. So, the Underground Railroad had many points of departure. It wasn't just kind of up through the east. 3,200 operators of this. Once again, Harriet Tubman was the kind of preeminent figure. She has an interesting background. She was born a slave herself, but began working to free her family members. She escapes north, and she decides that she wants to make sure her family gets out first. Well, she gets 19 trips to the south, gets most of her family out, but then she decides that she is going to continue, and it actually helps 300 slaves to escape over the process. What's crazy, she was kind of very intense, very didn't take any qualms about escaping. She kind of drove people north. She threatened to shoot those with pistols she carried on her hip if they decided to change her mind, right? So she's very serious, kind of a awesome badass, and that's why I love this picture on the guided notes. This is Harriet Tubman right there, right? She's not putting up with any crap. She is very serious about her job, and as a result, right, she never gets caught, and she actually moves 300 people north. So pretty incredible stuff here. And Harriet Tubman, as she should be, is very much celebrated for her heroism and her courage. Slave owners are not very happy, obviously, about this. The idea that their property is basically being moved north and no one's there to compensate them, right? Refusing compensation is not going to sit well. They are literally losing an investment, losing money inside of this system. And much to the North's delight, or at least to the abolitionists in the North's delight. But no, this will create another excuse for secession, right? The South, is not going to be cool with the fact that they're losing hundreds and thousands of dollars to these escape systems, and there's no sense even that the northern states will do anything about it, right? This is definitely sectionalism and division mounting as a result of the presence of the Underground Railroad. Last thing we'll talk about today is Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. Probably one of the most influential accounts of resistance, and it kind of reads, even though it's a novel, it reads like kind of an expose in journalism of the conditions of slavery in the South, and really does an unbelievable job at swaying public opinion against slavery in the North as they're exposed to what's happening. Harriet Beecher Stowe is actually a white woman. She, her history is one of religion. Her parents her dad was a preacher. Her brother was also a preacher and an early abolitionist. And she actually will move to Cincinnati at one point in her life, and Cincinnati is going to be right on the border of the border state, Kentucky, and she's going to be exposed to many former slaves and hear their stories. And she starts to write these short stories, kind of capturing the emotion of the violence. She's very, very good at doing that, kind of capturing this family relationship, or black and white relationship even, between slave owners and slave masters that shows the brutality and shows kind of the evils and the reaction of slaves to this sort of brutality, or maybe lack of reaction, right? Because they couldn't necessarily do much for fear of being overly punished. But the North, like I said, is going to be outrage over this presence of slavery. Okay, it creates an enormous wave of abolitionist sentiment in the North and makes it go from a radical wing movement to a more mainstream movement. The book is enormously successful in the beginning. It sells close to 300,000 copies in the North. And really, the idea is that if you're reading this in the North and you find out about what happens to slaves when they're caught and returned, and the whippings and the brandings and the degradation that happens, maybe even the killings. If you're a Northerner and you are aware of somebody that's transporting slaves, or you come upon a fugitive slave, or even suspect that a slave might have escaped, maybe before you read this book you follow the law and you go, maybe we need to send this person back. That's the law. We should uphold the law. But now, after reading Stowe's account, you kind of get the sense that it would be immoral to follow the law. And so the Northerners decide, we're just not going to follow the law. We're not going to alert anyone that a slave has escaped, or we're aware of it. Or we're not going to press the issue, right? If there's even a suspicion, we're not going to take any steps to make sure that we contact anyone. We're just kind of turn a blind eye. And so, once again, as a result of this book, just like the Underground Railroad, Southerners are not going to be entitled to seeing their property returned. No one's going to be sympathetic with the Southerner after reading this book. In Britain, this book actually sells way better than the United States. It's very, very popular. Stowe is very popular in Britain. And what's interesting, if we look a couple decades down the road, is that Britain is going to be pretty happy actually about a divided U.S. because it will actually benefit Britain from a commercial standpoint. But when it comes time to potentially supporting the Confederacy during the war, many in the South will not do so because of this memory of treatment of slaves. And that might not have been the case if we don't get this kind of glaring expose of the horrors of slavery. Britain may have been more inclined to support the South, especially because, as you know from previous chapters that we've read, they are incredibly tied to the South's cotton economy, right? The majority of cotton is not going to the northern United States. It certainly is going to the northern United States. The majority of cotton is actually going over to Britain. And Britain is going to be very dependent on southern cotton for their industrialization, right? So we kind of have a paradox here, and that the public are outraged over the immoralness or amorality of the slave system, and yet their industrial base is being fueled by the textile industry, which is dependent on the cotton production of the South. So it's very interesting. It's going to be a hard decision to make for Britain when they come to the decision of whether to support the South or not. And of course, they don't support the South. But interesting stuff here, right? Maybe Uncle Tom's Cabin helped sway it. And I'll actually show you a little copy of the first edition. There it is, the first edition of Uncle Tom's Cabin. There you go. All right, guys, some questions are going to go with this, 10 questions. They should all be in this video and in your textbook. And like I said, if you want to use the guided notes to kind of answer these things, feel free to go and fill those out as well. All right, good luck.